the tendency can be to try and elevate the story with the music, whereas I think with this one it was very important that the music just gives you enough, just an emotional layer. Hi, I'm Joe. I was the sound designer and mixer on The Journey.
Hi, I'm Laura Lee. I'm the senior audio producer on The Journey.
The Journey is a 1.5 minute film for UNHCR, and the film is shot entirely at a female protagonist's feet. So it was a really exciting opportunity to use sound in unconventional ways.
We were approached by Anonymous Content, and we were really, really excited about Pantera's director's treatment. One thing in particular that really captivated us was their idea of this one long shot. And not only was it one long shot, but as Joe mentioned, it was specifically of just her feet. And the idea behind that was that they really wanted to try and help the audience identify with her struggle. That choice of framing, it sort of deliberately excludes a lot of information that would otherwise normally visually be kind of conveyed, like her facial expressions or her body language. And because we didn't have that, that was where we really came to the party and kind of elevated that story to life.
Often when you get a POV sequence, that will just be one moment within the context of lots of other types of shooting, but in this case that was the only thing. So the way that we structured it really helped with that, which was the sounds of her, so her movements, her feet and her breaths, those were kind of the center point in the mix. But then the atmospheres that surround her, we had a bit of creative freedom to kind of always think of how that might feel in real time. One thing we really were keen on was with each of the scene shifts, we wanted the film to feel like there's a lot of time in between each of these scenes. Each of the cut points is deliberately as hard as possible. So usually when there's different cuts in a picture, you would smooth out those transitions so that the viewing experience is quite smooth. But in this case, we wanted those to feel as hard as possible. So for each of those, we were adjusting the frequency content so that you'd be constantly being shocked by each cut in the picture. It's more uncomfortable to watch because you're constantly being jolted around.
It induces that anxiety that we were sort of trying to convey. And also I recall the original script, and with each sort of scene it just had like in capital letters bang, 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 bang. And so that was the conversation starter in how we were going to convey that.
In terms of finding the sounds, I actually used a lot of sounds that I've recorded personally in the project. Certainly for some of the background voices, there's layers of various protests and marches and things that I've been to with my sound recorder. Particularly for the opening sequence, we looked at sort of POV sequences in war scenes in general, but I think for this film the one thing we wanted to convey was the raw sort of experience of her as these things are happening. So it kind of entailed a slightly different approach, which was how would that war sequence sound if you're actually there? And it's almost like a piece of journalism. If you watch a news piece about a conflict zone, it has that really abrasive raw quality, and all of the gunshots and all of those things are all just really distorted, and we certainly took that into consideration as well. It was more on the end of it feeling, as I say, very uncomfortable and abrasive, rather than super polished. She's always in motion, throughout the entire film. She never stands still. So that was a really important thing to try and convey, was that the sense of that she's been taken from her home and she doesn't know where she's going, and she's constantly on the move trying to get to somewhere that she doesn't necessarily know where the destination is. So that idea of kind of transience was something I really tried to get into the soundtrack as much as possible. So all the sounds, it's a very, very wide stereo image, and we used binaural processing, which essentially is a three-dimensional space within a stereo setup. So if you listen to the film on headphones, you'll hear that some of the distant impacts and some of the things that fly past camera, they actually they have the sense of going around your head as opposed to just being left to right.
Something that Pantera really, really wanted us to focus on, which we did in a few rounds of feedback, was really to hone in on her and our protagonist and really trying to convey her struggles. And through that, we did a lot of sort of internal vocalization and background dialogue of individual voices that you might hear in the context, as well as crowds. And then Joe can talk more about this, but we did then an ADR session with an actress that Pantera knows, and she was brilliant, and she really sort of brought our female protagonist sort of constant panting, as Joe described, as she was constantly sort of moving. That really needed to be emulated in her voice, and that was like a lot of her breaths and all that kind of stuff, and that really just elevated it so much, and Pantera were really, really pleased with that outcome.
We really carefully worked through each scene to figure out what she would be feeling at any of those moments. And you would think something as simple as the breath, there's so much kind of you can convey just with the pace of the breath and how strenuous it is and how all of those things. And at any point during the mix, during the film, you'll hear the breath, but there's different levels of emotion going on there. That was such an exercise in simplicity. The music does exactly what the film needed, and yet it's so simple. Often, as composers, the tendency can be to try and elevate the story with the music, whereas I think with this one, it was very important that the music just gives you enough, just an emotional layer, and it's nice because that's a constant sound throughout the film. So you have something to tie with the protagonist sounds that does just highlight the journey throughout the film. It's there, it's unsettling, it's got that feeling of it's momentum, there's something, we're going somewhere, but it never leans into you should be feeling sad at this moment, you should be feeling triumphant or anything like that. It was clear that the sound design needed to be the kind of hero in the mix, and there were some conversations as well towards the second half, should the music kind of take over and become the hero, because at this point she's made it and she's kind of out of the situation. She's not suddenly okay, it's just that she's now in a different environment. For it to have had any kind of happy ending, as it were, would have just felt quite crass. It's that she's been through an immense struggle and she's made that into something positive.
Yeah.
But ultimately this is a story that goes on. This is just one individual that's done a brilliant thing, but many don't. I think that wider story was really important, rather than it being just about this one particular aspect of it.